Tonight, Canada and the U.S. are exchanging terms of a possible deal.
The world is bracing for a trade war. Donald Trump drew first blood. He slapped tariffs on three major players: Canada, Mexico and China.
Good evening. The Prime Minister has unveiled landmark legislation aimed at creating one Canadian economy. A campaign promise born out of trade tensions with the U.S.
U.S. car imports plunged by nearly 20%. Not because demand collapsed, not because factories failed, but because Washington dropped a tariff hammer on its closest neighbors. A 25% auto levy blanket, aggressive and fast. And it didn't just hit Canada and Mexico. Over 37,000 European cars, mostly Volkswagens and Audis, got stranded at U.S. ports, frozen mid-shipment. Baltimore, Houston, New Jersey parking lots turned into graveyards for unsellable inventory. The result? Canada's exports to the U.S. crashed nearly 16% in April, wiping out trade momentum and sending the country into a record-breaking $7.1 billion deficit, according to Reuters. Factories paused. Buyers hesitated. The damage wasn't theoretical, it was measurable, and this is just the start. Because what looked like a policy shift in Washington is now a continent-wide supply chain tremor. North America's trade lifelines, cars, steel batteries, food are fraying. And if the second quarter looks like this, the second half of 2025 could break something much bigger. What began as a single policy shift in Washington quickly ignited a full-blown trade escalation. In March and April 2025, the U.S. slapped a sweeping 25% tariff on nearly all Canadian and Mexican goods, while doubling down on steel and aluminum levies to 50%, triggering immediate shockwaves across North America. The White House framed it as national security.
We are going to be imposing a 25% increase. We're going to bring it from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on steel into the United States of America.
But for industries that rely on trust and predictability, it was something else entirely: economic warfare. Canada struck back fast. Prime Minister Mark Carney authorized retaliatory tariffs on over $30 billion worth of American products, targeting everything from agricultural exports to household goods. In Ontario and British Columbia, premiers didn't wait for instructions. They canceled government contracts with U.S. suppliers, pulled U.S. wines off store shelves, and openly called for energy export cuts.
Starting today, LCBO, the largest purchaser of alcohol in the world, will begin removing U.S. products from its store shelves.
Public sentiment followed suit. 91% of Canadians now say they want to reduce the country's economic dependence on the U.S., a record high. And this wasn't just online chatter. Mobile apps like MapleScan, which help consumers identify Canadian-made products, surged to the top of App Store charts. The message was clear: trade nationalism had gone mainstream. Meanwhile, Mexico didn't just join the retaliation, it prepared for escalation. President Claudia Sheinbaum warned the U.S. of multiple fallback plans, Plan A, B, C, and D, and made it clear Mexico wouldn't be cornered again. Behind closed doors, Mexican officials began drafting a targeted list of counter tariffs and exploring alternative trade routes to avoid over-reliance on U.S. markets. This wasn't a typical trade dispute. It was a rapid breakdown in the very system that held North America together. And with all three countries now digging in, the continent's economy wasn't just strained, it was splitting at the seams. The impact wasn't abstract. It hit where it hurts your wallet and your job. The tariffs meant more than just foreign policy posturing. They lit a fuse under U.S. manufacturing. With steel and aluminum tariffs now doubled, production costs for American factories are projected to rise by over $52 billion per year, according to FT. And that's not just spreadsheets and accounting. It's the price of every car door, refrigerator frame, or construction beam going up quietly but relentlessly. On the assembly line, the clock is ticking. Canadian automakers have already raised red flags, warning that critical components are getting stuck at the border. For industries like autos, where parts cross borders multiple times before a car is finished, the result is chaos. Reuters reports that U.S. factories could start running dry within days as parts delays ripple through supply chains. The factory isn't the only place Americans are feeling it. At the checkout line, grocery bills are swelling. With tariffs now slapped on imports from Mexico, the source of much of America's produce staples like avocados, tomatoes, strawberries, and peppers are seeing double-digit price hikes. Analysts peg overall grocery inflation between 8 to 12% in mid-2025, leaving consumers to absorb a trade war they never signed up for. For all the talk of economic protection, the reality is more painful. Tariffs may shield a few legacy industries, but they do it by raising prices on food-crushing supply lines and risking jobs in every warehouse and factory that depends on international flow. In this trade standoff, the cost of winning isn't just economic, it's personal. What Washington framed as economic self-defense is now reshaping the very architecture of North American trade, just not in the U.S.'s favor. The rollout of sweeping tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods in early 2025 was meant to bolster domestic industry and reclaim American manufacturing. But in reality, it triggered something very different, a quiet yet powerful realignment of the continent's supply chains. As tariffs rippled across borders, Canada and Mexico stepped into the vacuum, becoming critical detour points for global companies looking to avoid the new costs. Under the rules of the United States Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA products that meet specific regional content thresholds remain tariff-free, and multinational firms are moving fast to capitalize. According to Reuters and the Financial Times, companies are now reclassifying components, rerouting shipping routes, and reshuffling production blueprints. Auto parts, aluminum, steel, electronics, and basic consumer goods are being rechanneled through tariff-safe entry points like Toronto, Guadalajara, and Monterrey, bypassing traditional U.S. ports altogether. This isn't a workaround, it's a full-scale rerouting. Automakers and industrial suppliers, including German, Korean, and Japanese giants, are rapidly shifting final assembly operations to North American locations that avoid the penalty costs. The Associated Press reports that factory expansions in Canada and Mexico are accelerating, with companies investing in new plants, scaling up logistics operations, and training local labor to fill the production gap once served by U.S. cities like Detroit and Cleveland. In effect, Washington's tariffs have done something few expected. They've made it more attractive to operate outside the U.S. rather than within it. For corporations under pressure to cut costs and maintain supply chain resilience, the decision is pragmatic, not political. If U.S. ports are now toll booths, then the market will find another road. This is the true cost of tariff policy without a coordinated industrial strategy. While the White House sells it as protection, manufacturers see it as a barrier to efficiency. And when efficiency breaks down, supply chains reconfigure. What's emerging is a new industrial map of North America, one not drawn by policymakers in Washington, but by boardrooms in Frankfurt, Tokyo, and Seoul, and increasingly by plant managers in Ontario and Baja California. It's a shift happening out of necessity, not loyalty. The irony: America didn't just build economic walls, it incentivized its own exclusion. And the fallout is already showing. Cross-border truck volumes at key U.S. entry points are down. Warehouse capacity in Ontario is stretched thin, and new customs consulting firms have popped up across the continent, advising clients on how to meet USMCA requirements while avoiding U.S. duties. Trade hasn't stopped. It's just learning how to live without passing through the U.S. The longer tariffs remain, the more permanent this realignment becomes. And if current trends hold, the American heartland won't just be bypassed, it may be left behind. The fallout isn't just economic, it's emotional, political, and deeply personal. What began as a tariff dispute over steel and aluminum has morphed into something far more disruptive: a rupture in the North American identity. In April 2025, Canada's trade deficit soared to an all-time high of $7.1 billion, a direct result of plunging exports to its largest trading partner, the United States. According to Reuters, this wasn't a cyclical dip or a temporary mismatch in supply and demand. It was a warning siren signaling the breakdown of a once tightly woven economic partnership that had taken decades to build. South of the border, the ripple effects hit Washington's financial core. Markets grew jittery, investors pulled back, and industrial output began to contract. Companies that had already suffered from pandemic-era supply chain chaos now found themselves in a fresh storm of unpredictability, one driven not by viruses or war, but by policy choices made in the name of protectionism. Confidence, always the lifeblood of capital markets, began to evaporate. But the spreadsheets and headlines don't tell the full story. Because beyond the numbers, a deep cultural backlash was taking shape. Across Canada, public sentiment turned sharply anti-American. Recent polling showed that 91% of Canadians now support reducing economic dependency on the U.S., an unprecedented figure in the history of Canadian public opinion. And this wasn't just ideological posturing. Boycotts erupted almost overnight. Liquor stores removed U.S. wine and whiskey. Local shops swapped out American imports for Canadian-made goods. Digital tools like MapleScan, which verify if a product is locally made, surged to the top of the App Store. Consumers weren't just responding with wallets, they were responding with pride. It marked a shift from cooperation to resistance, from integration to self-preservation, from partnership to a quiet but widespread rebellion. Even U.S. allies within Canada began distancing themselves. Provincial leaders like Ontario's Doug Ford and British Columbia's David Eby pushed aggressive economic measures to reduce American exposure. Funding was pulled from joint projects, contracts were reassessed, cultural and economic realignment was no longer a fringe idea, it was becoming mainstream policy. What was once the hallmark of globalization, a continental alliance built on trust, efficiency, and shared prosperity, is now buckling under the weight of mutual suspicion. Tariffs didn't just tax goods, they taxed goodwill. And perhaps most dangerously, they fractured the foundational belief that Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. could weather political disagreements without jeopardizing the economic fabric that connects them. Instead of unity, the continent now moves with hesitation, calculation, and mistrust. This isn't a skirmish, it's a slow, unraveling divorce. It started with tariffs on steel and aluminum, but it didn't stop there. In just months, those taxes triggered cascading consequences: stranded vehicles at ports, surging grocery bills, retaliatory tariffs, factory slowdowns, and even consumer boycotts. What was once a predictable flow of goods between the US, Canada, and Mexico is now a maze of broken contracts and rerouted shipments. The USMCA, once hailed as the successor to NAFTA and a model of continental cooperation, now looks fragile, a treaty overshadowed by distrust. Cross-border relationships that took decades to build are unraveling not with fanfare but with quiet exits and new corridors designed to bypass American tariffs entirely. And here's the deeper truth. This isn't about protecting American industry, it's about ceding ground in the race to control supply chains. If this trajectory continues, if tariffs become the default tool of negotiation rather than the exception, North America won't just splinter politically. It will fragment economically into isolated zones competing against each other instead of building together. And the new map of North America. It's being redrawn without the US at the center. Subscribe now, because this is no longer about inflation or politics. It's about a complete rewrite of the continent's future.